So a couple things, because I know you're taking a Blackboard test. You want to make sure you always read the directions first and foremost. You have all the skills to answer all the questions at this point. It's just a matter of just kind of doing it. I think that's more of the apprehension and anxiety associated with this test, just getting it done and over with. Most of you are going to get through this just fine. And then if for some reason you don't, you'll find out what your mistakes are, remediate, and then we will get you back on track. Go ahead, Sabina.
Professor, there is a question under the practice drug calculation fall 2020 uh, regarding insulin sliding scale question. Can you go over it just to get an idea?
Sure. So really, it's just, it'll say the number. So let's say the number is 215, that their glucose number is 215. You just look at the chart and you're going to administer the units that fit within that range.
So, I have a quick question. There is a question. I have a test, like a practice test paper here, and there is a question: if the patient's blood glucose level before breakfast is 220, so what should you do? So when I look at the chart, 220 falls under like no coverage. So I'm gonna like circle the no coverage.
Correct. Yeah, you would give them, you wouldn't give them any insulin in that instance based off of that chart.
So that's it.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. So sometimes, usually you're going to be looking for how many units to administer, but if it's, you just do what it says to do in the chart. So if it says no coverage, if it says some number of units, or if it says call the MD, those are the three things that you're going to answer for the sliding scale question. Yeah. Good question.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So a couple things when you start up the practice drug calc exam, tells you to answer the numeric answer only. So that means you do need to be in the habit of writing your your units. But as far as for answering these questions, at least for the way it's keyed, they just want you to type in the number, right? So the example there is if your answer is 2.5 milligrams, you're just going to type in 2.5. And then for half dosages, and then I had a conversation with a couple of students actually over the last couple of weeks that were missing because they were just putting in 0.5. You got to remember there's a leading zero with those decimal answers, so don't forget your leading zero because it'll get marked wrong. All right. So if you haven't taken this before, this is what it'll show. I don't know if it's random order or not, but you could take this multiple times. The benefit of taking this multiple times, obviously, is that it will help you to practice just the way that you're going to kind of get your Blackboard test, as well as just practicing reinforcing the answers. So I can, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the ones that are pretty straightforward. If I answer something and you're not getting the same answer as me, just actually, let me try and minimize this a little bit so I can see. There we go. All right. I'm just trying to shrink my screen a little bit so I can pull up the chat pull down and the thing that way, if you have a question, you can raise your hand or just unmute, or you just type it into the chat. So if I answer something quickly and you're not sure how I got that answer, just stop me. Okay. So like, this is what you would put for this answer. Don't put a G in there. It would just be 1.5. Okay. Again, if you see something and you're like, where did you come up with that? Stop me. Okay. All right. Now for this one, I'm going to need to use my calculator because I don't have that memorized. So I'm going to take the patient's weight in pounds, 165, and I'm going to divide by 2.2. Now that one is an even number of 75 kilograms. So I just leave that alone. Now 117 should be a one that I'm going to have to do some work with. So I'm going to get 53.18181818. What am I going to put for my answer here? If I do 117 divided by 2.2 and I get an answer of 53.181818, what do I put as my answer in this box?
You have to put 3 significant figures, so, right?
Not
that-
three significant figures.
Oh,
But
not like chemistry. Okay, yeah.
That's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
That is a good thing to follow, but
Mhm.
in nursing, if it's a
Right.
number greater than 1, round to the nearest 10th. If it's a number
yes.
smaller than 1, round to the nearest 100th. That's the only reason, because sometimes you may not get 3 significant numbers. So good question.
Okay.
So you could type into the chat, or you could just let me know. Okay, good. Thank you, Alina. Yeah. I'm going to round up to the nearest 10th, and I'm just going to write 53.2. Yeah, I can always tell when someone's in chemistry. You get definitely indoctrinated into the 3 significant figures. You're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
It's not a bad thing. It's just there are semantics sometimes, particularly with nursing, that you want to make sure that you know. What do you guys get for number 5? Good. That's what I'm getting to. 82.7. So we don't need to round up. All right. Now 200 milliliters to ounces. Now you need to remember that there are in one ounce is equal to 30 milliliters.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's helpful. I'm going to see if my pen will work with this. I don't know that it will. Oh, yes, it will. All right. So I am going to write out here. I'm going to take my 200 milliliters and I'm going to convert milliliters to ounces. Again, you don't have to do it the way I'm doing it. This is just a way to help me out and to just give you a visual description of this. So we're canceling out milliliters, and the only thing I need to know, and this is something you have to have memorized, it's not going to be given to you. You need to know that 1 ounce is the same thing as 30 milliliters. Sorry. Oops. $30 milliliters. Okay, so milliliters cancels out, and I'm just going to take 200 divided by 30, and I'm going to get 6.6 repeating. Okay, so 6.666666666. Because this is a number, I'm just going to close out of that. Because this is a number, oh, that's going to stay there until I clear it out. Because we're going from metric to household, just like going from pounds to kilograms, we're going to round this to 6.7. But something like this, 0.35, we wouldn't round that. First of all, we wouldn't round it because it's a number less than 1, but we also wouldn't round that because we don't round when we stay within the same metric system, we don't round those numbers. Let me clear out my annotation because that's just going to follow us and be annoying. Okay. All right. 30 milliliters to teaspoons. So you need to remember that 1 teaspoon is 5 ml. So you can do that a couple different ways. You could just do that in your head and say 6 teaspoons, which is what it is. Or I just want to make sure I didn't put it in. Or if you're doing the math aspect of it as a refresher, you're going to take the 30 ml, and then I'm just going to do a conversion. I'm trying to go to teaspoons. 1 teaspoon is 5 ml. 5 goes into 30 6 times. Now, remember, when you watch this again on the replay, if you watch this again on the replay, these what I've drawn should recreate on there, and then you can always pause it if you need to come back to see how I'm setting these up, just in case you need some additional practice. All right. Tablespoons to milliliters. You need to know, because it won't, again, this won't be given to you, but you need to know that 1 tablespoon is equal to, so 1 tablespoon is equal to 15 milliliters. Okay. So all you're going to do then is take 2.5 times 15, and you're going to get an answer of 37.5 milliliters. All right. Ounces to milliliters, we already talked about. Remember, 1 ounce is 30 milliliters. So for this one, I'm going to take 1.5 times 30, and you're going to get 45 milliliters. I'm saving all my answers here. I think it does it automatically. All right. Now here comes one where we might have to do a little bit of math work with, right? So this is, if you remember, last time we talked about this one, we talked about there's some key things associated with this particular type of problem. This is a fluid replacement problem. And a couple of things that we're going to be paying attention to is the what I call the theoretical or the expected urine output, the replacement volume, and then the actual output. So you have 3 numbers that you need to know how to arrange: 125 milliliters, 40 milliliters, 500 milliliters. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is, and I simplified this. If you're doing this another way and getting the right answer, you're fine. And I will say this, if you know that you're going to give them 40 milliliters for every 125 milliliters lost, and they actually lost 500 milliliters, try and rationalize what that's going to do to the number. Okay. So 125 milliliters, you know, how many times does that go into 500? You can think of it that way. And the answer to that is actually, it's, if I take 500 divided by 125, it equals 4. So in another way, if you're like, oh, my calculator's broke, I don't know, how else would I do this? 125 plus 125 is 250, plus 125 is 375, plus 125 is 500. So you can kind of work through trying to figure setting that up. But 125 milliliters is the kind of expected output, 500 milliliters. So it's a difference of 4. So you know that the number is going to get big. So if it were 250 milliliters that they actually lost, then it would be 80 milliliters is the replacement volume. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is just, if you can at least get directionally correct, it'll help you out. And so, okay. All right. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to, I created a formula. I'm not going to write it all out. It's in the tips. It's in the previous recordings. But basically, we're going to take what the patient actually voided, put that over the expected or theoretical, or whatever you want to call it, output, and then multiply it by the replacement volume. So it's going to look like this. I'm going to take the patient's volume that they actually voided over the expected volume, and I'm going to multiply by the replacement volume. And I think I got asked this question last time. You know, do we divide first, then multiply, or multiply across the top, then divide? Either way, you'll get the same answer. Okay. So in this instance, I'll tell you, I'm going to take 40 times 500, gives me 20,000, divided by 125, gives me an answer of 160. So that's what I'm going to put as my answer. Now, the only time this might get a little bit tricky is sometimes after 4 hours, the patient may have only voided 75 milliliters. So if they voided less than what for every 125, that means your replacement volume is just going to be less than 40. So just pay attention to that. If you don't put the big number over the small number, that's not always the case. Put what they actually voided over the for every number times the replacement volume. This does work with dimensional analysis. The problem is explaining with dimensional analysis with all these milliliters. I actually do ratio proportion for a problem like this. But just letting you know. Important thing is, and I didn't get too many questions on this one. I think most people are probably okay with this question. And maybe I just spend too much time on it. I'm going to do the same thing with this. So look, this was written very similarly, but the numbers are different. For every 100 milliliters of urine output, you're going to replace with 30 milliliters. If urine output for the last 3 hours is 400 milliliters, what would the replacement volume be? So go ahead and once you know that answer, go ahead and put it in. Okay, I'm already seeing. Okay, clearly I'm going too slow for you guys, which is fine. That should be, and that's what I got as well, is 120 milliliters. All right. Your patient receives 500 milligrams by mouth, BID twice a day. You'll give how many capsules per dose? I had another conversation recently, and the question was, what if it doesn't tell you per dose? What do you calculate for? The default is per dose. If it tells you per day, that's what they want. If it tells you per dose, great. If it doesn't, if it just says you will give how many capsules, like it doesn't say how many, or it doesn't say per anything, just assume that it's per dose. Okay, that is the default, unless it tells you otherwise. All right. So we have 500 milligrams by mouth, BID. How much are we going to give? So first of all, we have to figure out, okay, well, how many do we have? Well, we have 250 milligram capsules. Okay. So I'm going to give what? 2 twice a day. Good. That's what I got to. So just 2. You don't have to write 2 capsules. Just write 2. All right, for this question, it says, how many milliliters will you administer per 1 dose? And to answer this question, you got to put a label or mark on the medicine cup. And so that's how you're going to answer this question. So it says 40 milliequivalents by mouth 4 times a day with juice, potassium chloride, 20 milligrams per 15 ml is available. You're going to take, if you're doing this dimensional analysis wise or ordered over half, I would probably just do this ordered over half. I would take my order 40 divided by available 20 times my quantity 15. And then I'm seeing you guys marking it in there as 30. So let's see here. Usually they give you, I'm trying to see. Oh, should give me, there we go. Okay. So I just put a marker there. All right. Dilantin. This question says, how many teaspoons will you given? Okay, so that's the thing to pay attention to. How many teaspoons would you be given? The order is 250 milligrams. You have 125 milligrams per 5 ml. I went over a question similar to this. Remember that 5 ml is the same thing as what? 1 teaspoon. So if you do 250, your order over your available 125 times 1 teaspoon, 250 over 125 is 2. So if you got 2 teaspoons, that is correct. The most common wrong answer for this one is writing 10. Okay, because 10 is correct. It's 10 milliliters, but the question says how many teaspoons. So again, read the questions. All right. You have V-Silin K suspension. So remember, suspension tells you that it's a liquid medication. Okay, 150 milligrams. I think that's supposed to be a QID, but it doesn't really matter because it just says how much would you administer per dose. You can see that the available is 125 milligrams per 5 ml. So 150 Okay, so I'm going to actually work this one out just to be on the safe side. So I'm seeing you, some of you already putting your answers down. If I'm going to work this one out, and again, this is one where with the medication ones, a lot of times you're fine doing ordered over half. I'm going to take my order, which was the 150 milligrams, over my available 125 milligrams. And I'm going to multiply by my quantity, which was the 5 milliliters. Okay. And remember, I'm getting all that information just by looking at the label, not guessing at anything. It tells me everything I need to know. So 150 times 5 divided by 125. And most of you all already got it. 6 ml. Remember, we're just going to write the number 6. All right. This is that nystatin question. You've seen this in the practice test. Okay. 150,000 units 4 times a day. How many milliliters we administer? Well, it's 100,000 units per ml. So we're going to do 1.5 milliliters. Okay. And then for that one, if you're writing it into your calculator, my order is 150,000 divided by my available 100,000 per ml. So 1.5. Look at that. It's cherry mint flavored. Sounds gross. Okay. You have Valium 2.5 milligrams for anxiety, 5 milligrams available. How many tablets that's supposed to be tablets, not tables, will you give per 1 dose? So I'm going to do a couple things. You can just, do ordered over half. 5 divided by, 2.5 is the order divided by 5. And you're seeing it, you're going to get a half dose. Now, remember, before you started the test, the instructions said, if you have half, don't write 1/2, right? And I see you're typing it in there. Good job, everybody. 0.5. Perfect. 0.5 tablets. Oh, good. Another marking the cup. The nice thing about marking cups is your answer is always going to be here on the thing. And if you make a mistake, you can clear it. So if you accidentally click here and you're like, oh, no, that's not what I want, you can clear that number. Okay. So 375 grams. Available is 125 milligrams per 5 ml. What are you going to give them? Mark the cup. The first thing you need to remember is you got to convert grams to milligrams. Okay. So that 0.375 grams is the same thing as what? 375 milligrams. 375 times 5 divided by 125 is what you're going to do. Or I'm going to do it a different way. I'm going to say 375 is my order. I'm hoping everyone knows how I got 375 grams to milligrams divided by my available 125 times 5. That's where a lot of people make the mistake, is they forget to multiply by that 5. Don't forget to multiply by your quantity. You're always going to be safe if you do it without, did I guess 15 on this? Anyways, you're always going to get it correct, or you're always safest if you're doing dimensional analysis, because you at least can see how everything's organized. But if you're doing ordered over half, just remember it's ordered over half times quantity. Don't forget about the quantity. Yeah, so I'm going to drop a pin on the 15. I think I put it at 15 cc's. That was just, now they might mark this wrong. It just depends on how far their range is for the correct answer. But 15 cc's technically is correct because a cc is an ml. But the best answer would be on the 15 ml because it says how many mLs would you give? All right, digoxin. It's the order is 0.75 milligrams, and you want to know how much per dose. You can see what we have available. It's in micrograms, but in parentheses, it's also in milligrams. So since the order is in milligrams, and we have milligrams listed on as an option, that's the number you want to use. So you're going to take the 0.75 divided by the 0.125. Okay. And it says, if the patient's ordered that, how many times will you administer per 1 dose? Okay. So I'm just double checking my math because I'm seeing a number that I did not get. Yeah, that's the number I got, was 6. So 0.75 divided by 0.125, and they should be getting 6 tablets. Now notice that I'm taking time, I'm explaining all these things. We're going through this really slow, and it's been about a half an hour and we're already at question 21. So you have plenty of time to take this, breathe, think through each question, go back and double check your work, write notes so you know that you are not making any mistakes. And then you can always just go back and double check your math and then take a step back and say, does this question make sense? The way I answered it, does it make sense? All right. For this one here, it says cimetidine 0.8 grams by mouth daily. How many tablets will be administered per 1 dose? So Tagamet 400 milligrams is the available. And so what we're going to do is we're going to convert first grams to milligrams. So 0.8 grams is equal to 800 milligrams. My available is 400 milligrams. So 800 divided by 400, my quantity is per tablet. So the answer is 2. This question should look familiar. You've seen that picture before, the Aldamet question. Aldamet is ordered 400 milligrams by mouth 3 times a day. How many milliliters will you give per dose? So you're going to take your order, 400 milligrams. You're going to divide by your available, 250. And then you're going to multiply by your quantity. And it looks like we're all getting 8 milliliters. All right, moving right along. 75 milligrams of Demerol intramuscular. Now you may recall, like sometimes you might see on an ATI, it'll tell you to like how much to, or ask you how much to administer, but it won't tell you like milliliters or tablets or capsules. Anytime it's intramuscular or subcutaneous or IV, it's a liquid, so it's milliliters. Okay. The default, just like I said, the default before is per dose. The default for oral suspensions and injectables is milliliters. Okay. Even though your favorite medical drama might say, I need 100 cc stat, that might still be correct on how they say that. It sounds cool. Probably sounds cooler than saying I need 100 milliliter stat. But anyways, all right. So how many milliliters we give per 1 dose, and then mark the syringe. So this is another dropping the point like we've been doing. So we're going to take our order, 75. What do we have available? It says 50 milligrams per milliliter. So 75 divided by 50, it's per 1 milliliter. So the answer, as Sabina posted there, 1.5 milliliters. So I'm just going to look on my label and I'm going to make a point right at the 1.5. All right. Then it says 25,000 units subcutaneously. How many milliliters will you administer? Mark the syringe. So we have the order is 2,500 units. Available is 5,000 units. So I'm going to take my 2,500 divided by 5,000. And I'm going to get an answer of 0.5. Now, this is a funky looking syringe, right? So you got 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8. Well, we should be finding a 0.3 somewhere in the midline here. Okay. So let's see 0.2. Let's just see here. Yeah. So it's going to be at the midpoint of the syringe where the 0.5 would be. So 0.4, 0.425, or yeah, 0.425, 0.5 should be right there. Yeah, and all these syringes are a little bit different. You can see this actually will measure down to the hundredths, maybe even into the thousands place for these. That's actually, I said 0.4. These are actually hundredths. So this is 0.4, 0.41, 0.42, 0.43, 0.44, 0.45. and then all the way up to 0.5, 0.6. Okay, I think you guys probably know that. All right, one more question. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question. If you got like right answer, and if you mark on the like if you have to mark on the 0.5, then if you mark on the 0.4, would you still get marked?
So if the answer is 0.5 and you mark it at 0.4, it will be wrong. But
Okay.
if you are like, let's say you're here, but you're like, maybe you moved your mark up or down a little bit and it's not within the window that they have placed for you, they will go back and they'll hand like evaluate, and then they'll give you credit if like a lot of times on the real test, they'll remind you not to put the units in your answer. And people will still do it, and then they'll go back and double check the but I just say, just pay attention, read or listen when they tell you how they want you to answer it. And then you can even ask the question again. And you might be wondering why can't we put the units there? Because some people will write 0.5 milligrams. So let me just show you how some answers would be written. Some people are going to write like 2.5 milligrams, and some people are going to write 2.5 milligrams. Okay. One of those is right, one of those is wrong, depending on how it's keyed on Blackboard. So the easier thing to do it is just have it just so it's numbers, so you're not worrying about the spacing. And just so you know, the way I wrote it the second time, 2.5 space milligrams, that is the correct way to write that answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, one more. Morphine, 45 milligrams, IV stat. So remember, IV tells you your answer is going to be in milliliters, even before it asks for it. How many milliliters will you administer per one dose? Notice what we have here. It says 25 milligrams per milliliter. So this is a good example of a suspension or a reconstitution question. And I think it's a better reconstitution question than the examples that I was giving you guys. But one of the things you'll typically see on these is it'll tell you like 250 milligrams. I think I showed you last week, you know, that you sometimes have to go into the label to find each thing, but you don't have to here, even though it is listed. It says each ml contains morphine sulfate, 25 milligrams. It's restated on the label saying 25 milligrams per milliliter. So you're just going to take the 45 divided by the 25, and you're going to get an answer of 1.8. Now that should be all of, it should just be 1 through 25, but I see there's, what, is there one more? Oh, there's a couple more questions. So we'll just continue this. These are good practice questions. I just wanted you to get an idea that how quickly you'll be able to go through this test, even with someone talking through it the whole time. You'll have plenty of time. Here's another morphine question. It says 5 milligrams for acute pain. It says 10 milligrams per 10 ml. And then in parentheses, 1 milligram per 1 ml. So that's what you would do. You just reduce, and a lot of times they'll do that for you. So 5 ml. All right, so this was the question that was asked. It says, you know, the order, how many units of insulin we administered. The patient's blood glucose level is 200. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look and see where that glucose reading falls. So what do you guys think the answer would be for this? Good. You got it. Yep. Now remember, they just want the numerical answer. So just 2. Okay. If it was 320, you'd give them 6 units. If it was 385, you'd give them 8 units. You would just give whatever it says in the sliding scale. You just follow that. If it was 420, you'd say, call 911. If this is at home, call the medical or call the MD, hit the button, you know, call button. Something's happening. Okay. This one is just circling or choosing the correct syringe. Patients receive 10 units of regular insulin, 20 units NPH. You got to choose the correct syringe. The insulin will be given it. So you don't even need to mark the number. But if you want to, just as oh, you know what? This is one of those ones where you got to pay, because it says please select the correct syringe. I do believe when they want you to do this, they might want to just check the letter. So you have two syringes here. One's in milliliters, one's in units. Okay. We're administering units. It doesn't say anything about milliliters. There's nothing to convert milliliters. Even if you know how to convert regular insulin units to milliliters, if it's not labeled in the question, that's not what you choose. So B is what you would choose. You could also put a mark at 30. I think if I were answering this question, or if I were writing this question, I'd probably say choose the correct syringe and place a mark at the total is probably how I would have worded this question. That way you would mark it at 30. But as long as you choose B, you should be good. All right. All answers are saved. Let's see how we did. Oh. Uh-oh, I missed one. What'd I miss? I bet you it was that syringe. I probably chose it at the wrong spot. Let's see. Yep. So I chose here. I chose the right syringe, but where they have the marking is not correct. Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe they did want it marked at 30. It's a good question. But I think that if you were to miss that, first of all, you're probably not going to complain, because if all you missed was one, then you'd say, all right, I missed one. That's it for me. I passed. I'm not going to worry about this again until next semester. However, if you're between a couple, just make sure you double check your test. And then if there's something that looks questionable, because the other thing that's kind of beneficial, if for some reason you don't pass and you need to remediate, I can actually go in and see how you did. And then I can look at it and then give you some feedback on things. Go ahead, Kelly.
So since the real test is on Blackboard, will we see our results right away after we're done?
That's a good question. I don't know. I know that you have options as an instructor on Blackboard where you can choose to show results immediately, or you have to wait until everyone has taken it. So it depends. I'm not sure.
Okay. And just to be clear, how many questions was it again?
Your test will be 25 questions.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, 25 questions, and you have an hour to complete. Go ahead, Heaven.
So on, will it the same layout be like this, or is it like the rest of our exams where we just like answer and then go to the next question?
Oh, you mean like one at a time?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know that. I don't know. It might be one at a time. Just be prepared for that. If that is the case, just make sure you're paying attention to your time. And then, don't waste too much time on the ones that you got down. Like if you know how to do your conversions and you know how to do the simple oral med questions, don't waste a whole lot of time on those. Just, double check your work before you move on. And then if it is the whole thing and you can go back, obviously go back and review. My guess is it's going to be, you should be able to go back, to review your answers since it's a time test. But I don't know that for certain.
Okay, yeah, because that's what I was wondering. My next question was gonna be like, are we able to go back if it's one at a time?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, because I'm not the one writing your test, so I don't know. But those are great questions. Like, write those down, email your instructor, and just ask. Hey, just want to understand like what to expect on this. I think that's a fair question. So, all right, so someone asked me to go back to number 18. So I believe that's this one. So for this, if we're writing this one out, okay, I'm going to take my order. So what was my order, right? My order is 2.5 milligrams. My available is 5. Now, this always looks a little bit weird because usually the big number's on top, but big number, small number positioning has nothing to do with with doing and solving the math here. And then it's times one tablet or table. Just gonna write tab. And then all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my calculator, I'm gonna take 2.5 divided by 5. And I'm gonna get 0.5 as my answer. Now sometimes, and then not obviously not on this test, but sometimes they'll want you to write half, like 1/2. But I have a feeling that the most common way that they want you to write this is the way it's written right now, at least in nowadays, because they want to make sure that you don't accidentally think that's like 1 or 2. It's actually 0.5. All right. Were there any of these? I know I went through them really quickly. Are there any of these that you'd like to see again? Any ones that you got stuck on? Ones that you may have missed?
I have a question.
Yes.
Do we save, it's been a while since I took a test on Blackboard, but after each question, do we save our answer? Or can you submit without saving the answer?
It looked like it was auto saving after
Auto
every
save?
time
Oh.
I answered. So
Okay.
I don't know. And that might be something that might be different depending on
Okay.
how the test is set up. So I would just ask your instructors. But if you see an option to save, just
Okay,
click it.
save
Yeah.
it, save it. Okay, just want to make sure. It's been a while since I took the Blackboard test. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Oh, in terms of studying, what would you suggest between now and the test?
So what I find is most helpful is just going through the practice problems that you have, the Blackboard ones, the ones that are on the OneDrive folder, and then they're also on Blackboard too. So like, let me just clear out of here and show you. See if I can get out of here. Okay. So right here, there's a hard copy practice. So if you go in and open up the hard copy practice for 110, that's a good you could just go through, even if you've gone through it already and you've answered them all and you got all the key, everything answered correctly, it's still good practice just to kind of writing it out. You're trying to kind of create that motion of, I know how to answer these questions by writing it out in these steps. So that's what I would do, is I would go through. Additionally, you can if you go to some of my other semester folders in the OneDrive folder, there are, like, I got 110 for North Campus for Boyce questions, and so there's some similar questions, but there's also some different questions. If you are on my YouTube channel, there are some questions that are similar, some that I've changed as we've kind of gone through. That's kind of the benefit sometimes of coming to a live review, is just that you can kind of see that I went through and I did a variation of that question, or I changed the way it was asked. I don't unfortunately have it coordinated in such a way that I can tell you like, oh yeah, this is what we did this time. But I would say if it was me, and with the finite time you have until Monday, I think that's when most of you taking your thing, is I would just make sure, go through the practice test and just practice setting them up, just making sure you can get them answered correctly every single time. And just realize the only thing that's going to change on this test is that the numbers will be different. The meds might be a little bit different, like differently named, but the way you're going to set them up is exactly the same.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All right. Well, if you don't have any other questions, if you we'll go ahead and we'll shut this down for today. But if you do have questions between now and Monday, feel free to email me. If you're going to email me over the weekend, just know that I may not get back to you. So I would say just try and email me between now and Friday. But I will check I do check my emails regularly. So I will check to make sure if you do message me over the weekend that I try and answer your question. And if I don't hear from you, good luck. I think you guys are going to do great. Just continue to practice, and then if worst case scenario, you need to remediate, I'm here to help you out with that. But I have a feeling if you've been here on these reviews at least a couple times, you should be fine.
Well, thank you so much.
Yep, you're welcome.